Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today.
The body of Christ is making Jesus irrelevant. And if we're going to make Jesus relevant for everyone in Greater Austin, we've got to put all the rungs on the ladder. The very first church, they dealt with this tension. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. No, we believe that is through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are. And then James, the brother of Jesus, stands up. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for Gentiles who are turning to God. It is our duty, it is our job, it is our responsibility, the North Star, is let's make sure and put all the rungs on the ladder. Let's not make it difficult for people who are turning to God.
Well, I guess I just got to get started. This is the hardest part of Story 512 as well.
Getting going?
Yeah.
Yeah,
like, with a sermon, there's like a...
You got to pop the
rolls,
clutch.
you know? And then it's like there's a video, and then the lights are on, and you got to go. It'd be really weird if you didn't go. But when you're like recording something, it's like...
I know.
How do we roll?
Have you driven a car with a clutch?
No. Mm-mm.
Wow. So popping the clutch is like... It's like... Like once you pop it, like it's in gear, and you're like either stalling it or you're gone.
Emily learned on a manual.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There you go.
that's how she learned how to drive.
She knows popping the clutch.
And I've never even attempted.
Yeah. See?
There's something that's not relevant to me. Which, speaking of relevant, is in the series that we're in. But in all seriousness, I mean, we're in part 2, and I'm excited for what's coming up this week as you conclude it. But it's a series really based all on our vision. And before we kind of even get into a recap, I am curious. You started with a list of NASCAR, salmon, right, and UFC.
Oh, yeah.
Those are 3 things that we're not that now are.
Very relevant.
And all 3 of those for me are kind of still in an irrelevant category. And I was wondering, like, are all those moments still ahead of me? Like, might they all switch in the future for me?
Yeah.
NASCAR, I've always struggled with, just kind of going in circles.
Have you been to one, though?
No, that's what I'm saying. I've never
attended catalyst.
one. Right.
That's the something that happened.
I believe it. Like, going to a race was the catalyst for me that got me into running. Like, the 6,000 people and everybody and all accomplishing and crying and signs. And I'm like, this is cool. There's an energy.
Right.
But I've never been to NASCAR. UFC feels more relevant. I'm like, I enjoy. I think my height was when Conor McGregor was at his height. That was like when I most had somebody. I'm like, I can't wait to watch him.
Yeah, well, the waves were high then. And they probably still are, I'm sure for UFC fans, like really dedicated ones. But he brought a very unique energy. It's like a Tiger Woods kind of energy or Muhammad Ali kind of energy. Yeah. There was just something so like his charisma and all that stuff. So, but I'm telling you, you go to one of those too. Yeah. I was very fortunate. A buddy of mine invited me, and I was like, all right. And he actually bought floor seats. And so on the floor, giving fist bumps to fighters as they're walking out. I got a selfie with Bruce Buffer. It's time. And I was like 8 years old.
I want him to like read me the dictionary or something.
Oh my gosh.
Like, it feels like anything would be
I don't know how you could sustain that. That'd be like in 60 seconds, you're like, Bruce, seriously, no more reading.
Read a menu or something.
He's yelling at you the whole time. Like veins are popping out his neck. I mean, the poor guy.
I know.
But if you go, I think the NASCAR thing.
Yeah.
I think the UFC thing. And then have you tried salmon?
Okay. Salmon's a little different. I like seafood, but Emily doesn't, and so we rarely find ourselves at like a seafood restaurant,
Right.
and she doesn't really like cook it, you know. So it's like pretty, and it's like a little slightly more expensive, you know, just like a little bit, but it's like chicken, and it's like it's just cheaper.
Yeah, chicken.
So I just end up, but I do like it. I've never been anti. It's just
Salmon?
not like a regular part of the rhythm.
Well, you and Emily should come over to the house.
Yeah.
We'll cook you some salmon.
Yeah.
And I'll cook it the way I cook it, and I spice it up. I mean, it is spiced. And so Big John, my 13-year-old twin, he's not my twin. He's my son. He happens to be a twin.
Thanks for the
13,
clarification.
and I'm like,
My
not 13.
13-year-old twin.
So just in case you were wondering if you're listening or watching, that you're like, how do you have a 13-year-old twin? Anyways,
Oh my gosh.
but he loves it. He's into the way I cook it.
Yeah.
And who knows if that's just because I'm his dad or if it's actually good.
Yeah.
So,
Well, see, there's certain things like because you mentioned like the TB12 method being the origin of that, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
there's certain things I almost intentionally avoid because I know it would become like over relevant to me.
Right.
Like CrossFit. I'm like so nervous to do CrossFit because I think I could love it and I don't want to love it, you know. If I like read the TB12 thing, I think I'd be doing all of it. I'm like, now I have to every day. Like, so I get nervous. But there's some big, that was the question. Like, even I was like, what are some of the, ones that become relevant? There's some big things like UT. I used to hate because I moved here. When I moved here from Ohio, I was an Ohio State fan. And it was actually like that first year that they played in, they played like the 1-1 here and there. And UT beat Ohio State in Ohio State, and we beat McCoy here, and all my friends were like talking mess with me because I was an Ohio State fan. So I like really was anti-UT.
yeah.
And then I like went on a college visit, and I went to an OU Texas game.
Oh.
It was Colt McCoy versus Sam Bradford. I think OU was 1, Texas was 5. Jordan Shipley like returned that punt in the third quarter. It changed the whole game or whatever, and we ended up winning. And that was like I think
That's
I
a
could
catalytic
like UT.
event.
Yeah, and we're like because then we're walking like shoulder to shoulder with all the OU fans. Like I'm screaming Texas fight like I've been bleeding orange my whole life.
Yeah, from the
'cause
time
we're
I was born,
right in
people.
their face. It was a crazy experience. But
See? I'm telling you, it's that's how the relevance thing. That's how it works. It's very much something happens.
Yeah.
There's this. That's the story. It's like whatever it is. It's like and then I went to the Texas OU game.
Yeah.
That's the something. You're like there.
I was noticing how many were like this event kind of category as you were saying that. Because UT at that, like I've always pointed to that first OU game that I went to. Like running was the first race. I went to watch Emily at a race, and like the huge crowds and the energy and seeing people so into it was interesting. Like Jesus, I didn't grow up in church. So, I was 17 and get invited to like Inside Out, and it's an event, a place, there's energy or other, like you have relationships with people. It's like, that's kind of an interesting, never really like thought about that, what are some of the consistent patterns. Anyways.
Very wild.
Yeah. But this week we were in part 2 of that. We were just talking about more things that are relevant.
Back to the point of this.
But we got a little bit more practical to say, like, okay, we want to, this Acts 15 kind of model, have a church that has all of the rungs on the ladder. What does that look like? Because there are a lot of, and this isn't exclusive to church world, I don't think either. There's all kinds of places that you can go, and some do a great job of keeping guests in mind. Like you go to a Disney World, and it's like, maybe your 20th time or your first time, you're gonna have a great guest experience. And then there's some exclusive restaurants you like walk in, and it's like super like awkward and uncomfortable because there's like this already elitist feel that you go in, like you should know what's happening and where to go and how to dress and what to order and all of that. So, but in church world, that seems to be like the gravitational pull of just, we are making the assumption that you can kind of already speak the language, that you already know the verses, that you see the Bible as authoritative, that you're on board, you're here to grow in your faith. Like we're making all these assumptions a lot of times, and that can make it really difficult for people that are on those first couple of rungs. And in this, week in particular, we're talking about what that looks like, what some of those mistakes can look like, and what maybe getting it right can look like, and how do we fight for that? Because it really is a fight. You acknowledge how we get that wrong all the time, and how is it we can learn, and even you invited people into it at the end to give us feedback, like how can we become better at that? And so the first question here, this is a little bit more of like actually kind of a history one. So if you're listening to this and you want to go like more practical in my life, that you could fast forward a little bit because those will be our next couple of questions. But this one is going back to that Acts 1. Yeah. And I'm curious, are there any learnings just when you look at the early church to be like, here's some principles, obviously different time, context, culture, but some principles that you could say, man, that we could try to apply that or learn from that today when it comes to building a church that have all of the rungs on the ladder?
Yeah, I think, when I read this question and thought about it, I think two things came to mind. It was, one is they lived out what they preached, and two is they were intentional about the structure of the church. And I think both of those were very helpful in keeping all the rungs on the ladder of not making it difficult, as Acts 15 says, for those who are turning to God. And so I think, on the first part of that, living out what they preached, I mean, they met together, like Acts 2, read the last part of that chapter, and it just talks about, they're meeting together daily, they're holding one another accountable, they're breaking bread together, they're reminding one another what this is all about, like, hey, this is a movement, this is a gathering around not you, not me, but around Jesus, the Son of the living God. They're probably talking about, stories about Jesus and sharing, like, firsthand accounts, eyewitness accounts, and talking about the way he loved people, the way he engaged people who were far from him. And it's like, okay, guys, as a church, we want to continue this message. They're probably, encouraging one another with some of his final words, like Matthew 28. Okay, say, imagine being there, like in the first century, like, okay, he said, go. He said, go and make disciples. Like, go and, making a disciple is the idea to share the incredible news that Jesus shared with you and I, and share this with people in such a relevant way that they go like, wow, I'm curious about him. Perhaps I may put my confidence in him, but I need some evidence. And it's like they're talking about this, and like, guys, we were like on the other side of him. Guys, like we saw the stones, we saw the dirt, we saw the blood, we saw the sweat. Like the evidence is everywhere, and there's Bob and Frank and Jenny and all these individuals who were standing like right at the tomb, and it's like hundreds of eyewitnesses, and so they lived it out. They sacrificed and sold their property for one another. So like this radical love to go like, you just sold your property so you could pay for my debts? Yeah. Why would you do that? Well, because John 13 says, love as he loved us. He gave his life for us. Why wouldn't I do that for you? Like there's a need and I can meet it, so why not meet it? And people were like from the outside just going, oh my gosh, like all the rungs were definitely on the ladder, and people were like, that's beautiful. And even when they messed up, Matthew 18, they had to talk about this, where Jesus said, hey, when there's sin, when you guys are messing up, and like the very thing I called you to do, like, go, like Matthew 18, Jesus gives us kind of this overall principle: go individually, keep it relational, then go with a couple people, keep it relational, then go, like, make sure to live this out. And when you're not, just be honest and real about it. And hold one another accountable, because people are watching the church. People are walking in here going like, are you guys fake? Is this real? Is this? And they lived it out. And that was beautiful. And then I think the second part is they structured the church in such a way that, that like 1 Corinthians 14 talks about when somebody walks in and they're not a follower of God, like we could do all these really interesting spiritual things. And that's what 1 Corinthians 14 is about. Like all these people in Corinth had these crazy cool gifts, and now all of a sudden they're like, hey, look at my gift, look at how talented I am, and all, like they're competing for one another in a church service. And Paul's like, guys, seriously, people are walking in here, they don't understand the thing you're saying, they don't understand why you're doing what you're doing. Do things in an orderly way so that they may come to the place and go, there is a God, perhaps I am curious, perhaps I would put my faith in him. And so there's structure, there's order, there's intentionality. And then Paul even talks about, setting up leadership structures to go like, this is not about the lead pastor. This is not about the one celebrity, speaker or musician. This is about like the body of Christ. All the parts work together, guys. And so, set up elders and set up deacons and set up structures, checks and balances to make sure there's trustworthiness in this movement, so that when people invest financially, when people invest with their lives, like there's structure, there's a reason to trust. You're not only being authentic and living it out, but there's structure. So you see all of that in the first century church, and it's all being lived out, and it's all being formed, and it's beautiful, and it's relevant, and the rungs are on the ladder. And I think there's a lot of things we can learn from that, and a lot of things that we can like use that as a resource to go, are we doing those things? Yeah. Are those things true of us as they were true in the early church? Because in the early church, it changed the world. So can the world change again? Perhaps it can. Yeah. And let's learn from that.
Yeah. That first point that you were talking about, I can't help but think like in all those examples we first gave of, NASCAR going to a UT game or whatever, there's a passion, there's a fanaticism, there's like I'm all in on this when you're around it, Yeah. And I think sometimes because people take that to like a negative extreme, and you think of like, street signs on a corner, like, hey, everybody here is going to hell. Like that's what we picture when we picture like the fanaticism. And sure, there's an extreme version that needs to be done away with. But like if you walked into a place place and everybody's like, lukewarm, check the box is what I do. I got to go to church once a week. There's nothing inspiring about that to no matter what level of the ladder, you're on there. But I think about that with the early church to be like, they just didn't separate. It wasn't a once a week event. It was who they were. And they so lived that out. I think that there is something really attractive about that. Like when you go all in and you really believe. I think about like Jasper's story this week was so inspiring. I think part of the attractiveness was like, he's like, this is like a black and white, like I'm all in or I'm all out. Like if this changes everything. So he's like meeting with people and asking questions and going through all the groups in the process, and you're like, this is a guy who thought deeply about that, and there's an attractiveness to be like, I'm really going all in with this. And so it's an interesting piece that I think is true that the early church and can be true of like, great growing churches today. But
yeah. And as you were saying that, there are two things that really I think are important to hear is I think one is what Jesus invites us into is not religion, is not duty, is not disciplines. He invites us to give our whole identity to him. Yeah. The core of who we are is now him. And that is the center of everything that drives everything in our life. And so you see a bunch of people in the first century who weren't giving like, well, I'll give a little, I'll give a little piece over here. I'll maybe put a little money in the bucket. I'll serve maybe like 20 minutes. Their whole identity is my life is now yours. I have lost my life for years. And what they found is what Jesus promised in Luke 9, where he said, you lose your life for me, you're actually going to find something far better than you've ever found on your own. It's going to be through me, your whole identity. So I see that. And then in Jasper's story, I love his story because for me, it's a definition of faith. Faith, again, as I say all the time, is not the emotion. It's not like, man, I wish I had your emotion. I wish I had your fanaticism of, of this Jesus guy. No, it's like, he's like, okay, let me research it. Let me look at the evidence. Let me read the books. Let me, ask a million questions. And then he came to a point to go, there's plenty of evidence. It's very plausible what Jesus said. And based upon the evidence, the most reasonable thing I can do is to put my confidence in what Jesus said to put my confidence in. And that's Jasper's story. And that's the invitation Jesus invites all of us into, is not to have the emotion. Like that's, in my opinion, and you may disagree, that's weird. I'm like, no, I'm basing my whole life. There better be evidence to this. And what is the evidence? And that's what he did. And that's what I love about his story.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I was thinking that I don't think you can rank baptism stories. I don't know that we should, but like if you did, that would be like at the top of the list because it's just so great. So if you're somebody that hasn't had that experience, and meaning the positive experience, if you're somebody like you've given church a shot, had a bad church experience, and you walked in and it just felt like, and sometimes it's very forward facing, sometimes it's a little more unspoken, but just this place is not designed with me in mind. This place, these are not my people. This is like, I'm not that, I don't believe that. And so therefore whatever it is, don't feel welcomed here, can't ask questions here. What would you say to people that might be like listening to this, but are on the edge about, giving church a real shot because they've had those experiences before?
Yeah. Well, I would first validate that experience. I would first say, I've experienced that. I've talked to a whole lot of people who have experienced, walking into a place and it felt like the rungs were not on a ladder, like I didn't matter, like I was a project. I was some sort of like a formula was going to fix me, and so I if I'm talking to somebody like that, I would always just say, and if you're listening or watching, I would say, man, I'm really sorry. I think that's very real. And I think those experiences have happened. And unfortunately, which I hate to admit, I know they've happened at Northpoint. I know from, being, we started in 2009. So, that makes us 13 years that we have done some things that have not put all the rungs on the ladder, that have made Jesus not relevant, that have been hurtful. And, it's, those are the things that I'm like, gosh, I feel deep conviction. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to redirect and fill the gaps and lead more effectively and honestly just go back to Jesus to lead as, to find out where the gaps, what did Jesus do, and to keep our hearts and minds and eyes focused on him. And I would also just encourage a person that perhaps has felt, the gaps there, that, with anything, it's really important not to judge the whole based upon an abuse. Mm-hmm. Like if I experience this, therefore the whole thing is not from me. I experienced this aspect of it. I experienced this. I walked into this place, and it's not entirely fair, emotionally satisfying. But my encouragement would always to go back to the source. So what is this whole thing about? So it should be what I didn't experience, but what I know the source is this man named Jesus, and he lived 2,000 years ago. And my greatest encouragement is, again, to circle back to Jasper and his story on Sunday, is just to go back to what Jasper did, to go, there are imperfections because this is led by man, and these are a lot of man-centered ideas that are being expressed today in 2022. And there are flaws in that. And this is why every one of us need Jesus. This is why Paul says, for we all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all. And that's really important. So then what is the source of all this? What is the originator? And what is the author of this? Because if you go back to the author, I think you get the clearest picture of what this should be. And that would be my greatest encouragement. And then I think, to circle back to Jasper's point, I believe that if you truly go back to the author, and if you seek him, and if you are open and curious, I think you will find him. And whenever that moment happens, there's no formula to it, but whenever that moment happens and you find him, then I would highly encourage to go, whatever you experienced, like, now come be part of the movement and close the gap. Bring awareness to the gap. Bring awareness to the body of Christ. Bring awareness to the church to go, I walked into 17 different churches, and here's what I experienced. Guys, are you aware of this? Because I have gone to the source, and the source is real. The source is the way, the truth, and the life. The source is life and life to the full. It's my life. It's my new identity, and we've got to get this right. And so come be part of the body of Christ. Come be part of the movement. Come be part of one of the greatest adventures that Jesus has invited us into, and close those gaps that you experienced and I experienced. That's what I would say, something along those lines.
Yeah. It's almost like if the reason to walk away had to do with anything besides Jesus, don't close the door quite yet, Yeah. And I love the way you started, because that's not to invalidate what any of those reasons may have been.
Right.
It's just not gotten to the core yet of why I would accept or reject, right? So, no, that's really good. So what if on maybe the flip side of that, almost like if I am a follower of Christ, if I've made that decision, and I think you're going to go here a little bit even in part 3 this next week, but we'll still do this question and see what comes up. In your kind of day-to-day relationships, so there was a reflection of like kind of Northpoint as a whole, but like, if I'm a person, I'm a regular part of Northpoint, maybe even like how can I live this out personally in my life?
Yeah, I just think, I think one of the things I've learned, and the older I get as a parent, if I really want to capture the hearts of my sons, if I really want to do everything in my power to have a lasting relationship with my children, then the one word that always comes up is intentionality. Same thing in my marriage. If I really desire a great marriage, and I really desire, as far as it depends upon me, then the word intentionality comes up. So it's like this, scheduling it, put it on my calendar, put reminders to, keep an awareness. Like, it's so intentional. It's like, gosh, you're so intentional about like your personal physical health. Well, it's like, it's on your calendar. You pay for the gym, you have appointments. Like it is a priority, and it's intentional. So I think the same thing holds true when it comes to, putting all the rungs in the ladder of your personal life as a follower of Christ. And I think, I would just say a starting point would go, if you're going to not make it difficult for someone who is turning to God, which is Acts 15 in this Sunday, and so therefore you've put all the rungs on the ladder of your life to be a reflection of Christ, then it's going to start with knowing somebody who doesn't know Christ. And I would say that is a fantastic starting point, is to go, do you know anyone who is not a follower of Jesus? Do you know anyone who does not like the church? Do you know anyone who would say like, I think the Bible is archaic and man-written and is something we should not base our lives on? Do you know anyone who perhaps ask a lot of questions of God in terms of, why would God allow, certain things in the world if he's a good God? Why would God send people to hell? I mean, that's just an atrocious idea. That's such a evil idea. So I could never, are you having those conversations with people? Mm-hmm. And I would start there because I think that gives you a lot of perspective and context. And otherwise, you're going to go, I think all the rungs are are in my life, and I believe I've put all the good things there, and I think I've made it simple for people who are turning to God, but you don't know that, and it's really there's a lack of self-awareness. So my number one encouragement, and I think my number one encouragement to a follower of Christ in terms of like spiritual growth, is to say, be intentional daily about what Jesus said to be intentional daily about, to make disciples of all nations. Like every day, wake up and go, God, who is it that you want me to be intentional with? God, who is it that's far from you, who doesn't know you, who perhaps you are inviting into this incredible adventure of life? Who is it that I need to be praying for? Who is it that I need to, walk up to? Who is it like? And that in itself is one of the ways to be incredibly intentional. And I think it then begins to give you context and a resource to know what it looks like to put all the rungs in a ladder on your life. And so then, like, you read Colossians 4, and it makes much more sense. It's like Paul's like, okay, be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may, And so it's like this idea is to go, oh, well, that makes sense because I know Frank, and Frank is like far from God, and he's my friend, and we go to lunch together, and we work out together all the time, and he tells me why he's far from God, and he tells me what he's experienced in the church, and he asks me his questions. So, in other words, I understand what Paul is saying there, and I understand how, this idea to have my conversation, my words be full of grace, and then seasoned with a little truth. I understand what Paul's saying in Ephesians chapter 4, where he says, let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what's profitable to build people up according to their needs, so it may benefit those who are listening. So it's this idea to go, like, the church has said, don't cuss. That's the application of that verse. And I'm like, I want to cuss back and say BS. Yeah. I want to go like, are you kidding me? No, that's the idea to go like, enough people in your world who are followers of Jesus, not followers of Jesus, to know that, man, what comes out of my mouth is, as Jesus says, is an indicator of what's going on here. And what comes out of my mouth should be intentional, and there should be some sort of filter to go, people are listening, and is this profitable? Is this going to build them up, or is this going to tear them down? And by the way, people are listening. People are watching. And now all of a sudden this becomes, it's relevant. Now all of a sudden it's like my words matter, my actions matter, my attitude matters, like, my intentionality matters. And all of that, I think, again, starts with, it's because I know Frank. And Frank asked me a question when we were jogging on the treadmill, and it brought such relevance to what the rungs on the ladder look like in my life.
Yeah, I think it's there's almost this like weird balance of Christians a lot of times overthink this and then like underdo this or something. It's like if you're in relationship with, then and just authentically like that, it's going to lead to those types of moments and conversations and influence, because it's like, well, I need to start with the gospel, or something like odd. Like it's just like, hey, I'm a big runner. Before I meet you, Buck, I just want to talk about running. And you're like, well, what's for your name? You know what I mean? And at the same time, if we were friends for a while and running never came up, like, I can't talk to him about running because it's like, well, that's a big part of my life. You're going to hear about it. I can't help but talk about it because I'm excited about it. It's like there are these interesting pieces where when you look at Jesus's encouragements, it's impossible to get away from. There is some connection between the way that we treat people and do relationship with and how real God becomes in their life. Like you just can't get away with that. John 13, how you love one another, is how they'll know that you're my disciples. Like there's a very clear connection. Or Jesus prays for our unity, and he's like, if you stay unified, meaning the way that also Christians treat one another, by this, like they'll know that God sent me. Like they'll like trust in the gospel based on how we treat one another. So there's this incredible, just correlation between that. And I think people talk about both sides. Well, if you just build the relationship and you're just nice and you never actually share the gospel, it's like, well, yes, that's all a part of it. But let's just like start with knowing somebody's name, like you talked about, and see where it goes.
Man, I'm just if you do that would be my greatest encouragement.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Fourth question here. So a lot of people, view church as, with the lower rungs as missing the top ones. So it's like, there's even phrases and the way those churches are categorized and stuff. But my question is, like, is it mutually exclusive? So if you're going to, like, have the lower rungs, that means you got to sacrifice the top rungs. Or if you're going to, like, we're a top rung church, so we have no... Is it mutually exclusive? Is that even the way we should think about it? Or is it possible to have all the rungs on the ladder?
Yeah, if I understand the question right, I do not think they're mutually exclusive. I think they're part of a whole. I think they're all incredibly necessary. So I think keeping all the rungs on the ladder as a church keeps us grounded. Mm-hmm. I think it keeps us humble. I think it keeps us balanced. I think it keeps us laser focused on what the church should be laser focused on, that Christ is the Son of the living God, like he is our source for everything. And I think what happens is and we see this in life, is that, we kind of forget the bottom rungs. Like, we all entered through the bottom rungs. Mm-hmm. And so it's like this idea to go like, oh, that was once part of my life. And I'm so grateful that the church, made it easy to ask questions. I'm so grateful the church did the very simple, practical things in the parking lot and, with my kids, or, in the auditorium when I walked in, or, they did the very simple things on their website, or they did the very simple things when I first got involved in that group, and it was so relevant to my life. And it was so basic, but like, it just met me where I was at. And then, it's like sometimes we lose sight of that. Mm-hmm. And as a result, arrogance begins to come in, self-righteousness begins to seep in, and it's subtle. And we've experienced this in life. It's like somebody who, perhaps is, an intellectual, and, they started in maybe school, and they started like on the ground floor, and they started working up in academia, and, then they got their, master's, then their PhD, and then it's like they forgot they got their undergrad, they forgot they got their high school diploma, they forgot like what that was like. Mm-hmm. And they're always talking about, do you have your doctorate? Do and it's like all this fancy language. And that's not wrong, because that's real and being authentic to them. That's an important aspect. That's a huge accomplishment. Mm-hmm. But it's sometimes they've lost their kind of groundedness. They've lost their center. They've lost their balance, and it alienates a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, what if I just have a high school diploma? Mm-hmm. What if I don't even have my GED? Like what? Like do I matter to you now? Mm-hmm. Because you're just talking to everybody about their doctorates and all these big terms that I just don't understand. Like, I feel like nothing on the other side of you. And we've all experienced that, maybe in business, maybe in school, maybe in sports, maybe in like working out, It's like, have you forgot about the little guys? Have you forgot about like the people who are just beginning? Like, there was a beginning point. And I think what people really appreciate is somebody who may be at the top two rungs, and there's such humility to where they're like, oh, I get it. Mm-hmm. Like, I see you. You matter. You have worth and value in my eyes. Mm-hmm. And so if we're not careful as a church, and I get it, we use verses like this where Paul says, I'm so surprised you're on milk. Mm-hmm. You should be on meat. Mm-hmm. You're still like a baby. Mm-hmm. I mean, such shameful language, by the way. Yeah. I mean, come on. Like, why the heck haven't you grown up spiritually, people? And so we're like, we're meat eaters over here, and this is all the weird churchy things we start to say. And we like begin to like, own these terms like they're normal terms, and we say we're meat eaters, and people are like, are you eating steak? And they're like, we get. But I think you get to this place to go like, let's talk about eschatology. Let's talk about the JED theory. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that Moses wrote it? Mm-hmm. Do you not believe? I mean, were there multiple authors? Mm-hmm. Like, let's have this discussion. Let's talk about eschatology. Mm-hmm. And like, what are the different views of how the world's going to end? Are you post? Are you pre? Mm-hmm. Who are the 144,000? Let's go there, and and it's like, man, I'm learning Greek. It's, by the way, you're learning Greek, and like, it's like, and I know the Greek, and I can sing the Greek alphabet, and let me tell you, what this word means and the true meaning of this word. And you get in like these sections to where that's not wrong. That's beautiful. That's important. But you kind of lose your groundedness. You lose your humility. You lose the balance of going, what is this all about? Mm-hmm. The reason I'm doing this is so that I can go and make disciples. The reason I'm doing this is so I can be wise. The reason I'm doing this is for 1 Peter 3 is to give an answer for the hope that resides within me. Mm-hmm. This is about people who are not here yet. This is about people who are far from God. This is about people who do not yet know their Heavenly Father through Jesus Christ and experienced His grace, His mercy, and love. So can I get the meat so I can go do this? And can I get the meat so we can create a better church with all the rungs on the ladder? Mm-hmm. And all the rungs matter, because every single Sunday, every single day, people are engaging the church on social media, on our website, in person, online. So if if we lose sight of that, or they're mutually exclusive, then we create these very lopsided churches. One church is all about, hey, it's all about the aesthetics, it's all about the show, it's all about, the lights. And I'm not saying there's no authenticity. There is. I know so many amazing churches like this, but it's like there's no top rungs. There's there's no place to go from here. And that's certainly been true for our church for many years. But we've always understood that, man, we want to put all the rungs on the ladder. We've always had that, perspective to go, let's keep going. And the vice versa can happen. I mean, you start with a bunch of a church with a lot of folks on the top 2 rungs. Oftentimes you can get to a place where you just lose sight of the people that were so important to Jesus. And if the church should be the body of Christ, they should be important to every church, and not just in statements on walls and mantras and, slogans. They should be important, like in action. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think it's part of a whole. It's a process.
Right.
Like everybody goes through, from, like we've talked about, we did a series called Trail Markers, where it's like there's a spiritual growth. And it's like, from Trail Marker 0 all the way to Trail Marker 7, like all these are important, and you just can't take one out, because what's happening in Trail Marker 0, 1, 2 is really setting you up to be able to experience Trail Marker 6, 7, and 8. And if you don't go through those, so you can't diminish those, or it's that kind of thing. It's not mutually exclusive.
Yeah. And it's almost like each part of the ladder is better, right? Like if you have only bottom rung and there's nobody who is like ahead of you, maybe not age-wise, but perhaps age-wise, like stage of life to show you what's around the corner and so on, like you're going to make more mistakes and be led more astray and all that kind of stuff. Like you need that guide, you need that wise counsel. And likewise, like when you're on the, higher ladder, rungs of the ladder, or even if you were to just go with the age analogy, like looking back, you need the people behind you now that inspire you, and there's often a creativity, and you remember the early days, and there's a passion there, and there's a tendency to maybe get jaded if you don't have a young coming behind you, because now it's just like a cynicism sinks in. So there's this weird, like when you have the humility on both sides, that you can actually benefit from one another, learn from one another, and everybody's stronger. It's this interesting cycle of how it all works.
And that's why I would say, like I used, talked about Sunday, like we really have to fight for this. Yeah. We really have to put it front and center. This has got to be more intentional than normal things, because there's a slippery slope on all sides of it. Yeah. And so if we can do that, God willing, He gives us the energy and focus and intentionality to do that, then I think that makes something that looks much more like Jesus.
Yeah. This is like a bonus question. Maybe we'll cut it for time or something. But sure. When you hear like the request for deeper, like when you're like, man, somebody wants to go deeper, we want, deeper teaching or preaching, or, we want a deeper church, or I want to go deeper in my faith even, and that kind of stuff. What are you hearing when somebody asks that? Like, what do you think is the motive behind that question, or what do you think they're saying?
Yeah, I think, a lot of times my first response is like, that's a wonderful thing. That's a longing of your soul. That's a longing of your heart for something more profound, something like my counselor always said to me, I need a bigger God. And like to admit that, to go like, I think, the things I've done in my life, the things I've accomplished, I just need something bigger. I need something more. I need something larger. I need something more satisfying. There's a book that Jeremy, I've referenced the book that Jeremy Edlin, who typically does the podcast, although you're doing one wonderful, by the way. But Jeremy's, it says, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And I love the book, the premise of the book, because oftentimes you hear somebody say that and you want to get defensive and go, well, we're deep as a church. We do X, Y, Z, or you want to go, well, you just don't understand us. Yeah. Like if you understood us, then you would get us. But no, like there's something like what happened, like that's the surface, but what happened to you, there's something going on inside of you that's causing you to ask that question. And that's what I'm most curious about. So I think that's what people are asking when people are like, we need more depth. We need more. It's not necessarily like 3 or 4 verses. It's not necessarily like, hey, could you give us 5 more examples of the Hebrew, the Aramaic, or the Greek? I think what they're honestly asking is something of, they're saying it's like a self-admission. I'm looking for a bigger God. I'm looking for something more significant. And I think that begins a really cool conversation about spiritual formation, spiritual development. I think that there's some fantastic resources around, kind of the, if you will, using the word, the deeper aspects of what it looks like for a relationship with God to move into more of a loving, intimate relationship with God, and where it becomes not so much about doing, it becomes about being. So now, the first part of Christianity, which a lot of people get really stuck at, is like, here's all the things we've done, so I want the church to do more. What if it was actually about being with Jesus? What does that now look like? Because that's a whole intimate, relational, more contemplative space, and that becomes a little bit more mysterious, a little bit more harder to put your, to be linear with, to be, perfectly logical about. We want our formulaic plans, but what if that's actually our way forward? What if there was something so much more that God's invited you into, but it's something you haven't heard about yet? And so it begins a conversation about spiritual formation, spiritual development, which I just look for those, like if people are honestly seeking. And then I do think, from, this is, I do think sometimes that's a jab. Sometimes, people are taking jabs.
Yeah.
I think it's like we all have, as the Bible would talk about this idea of flesh.
Yeah.
Like this idea of like, there's stuff in us that ain't great.
Yeah.
And people are taking jabs and, people are talking about their previous church experiences and what was great for them as kids sometimes. And they'd love to see that. So sometimes it's like, I want to seek to understand before being understood.
Yeah.
So it's like, I want to understand that.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's all it is. It's like, oh, I didn't know that. And so sometimes it's, that's the depth. But
yeah. No, I would usually respond to people by asking exactly that, like, hey, could you define it for me? And it almost might sound combative, but there's a genuine desire in me to know, like, do they know what they're asking, and can we have a conversation about that, because if we're just going to do the jab back and forth, it doesn't feel helpful. But, if it's that genuine desire and I'm trying to put words to it, and so it's so interesting. And I think, we could have a whole different conversation, but just perceptions of what that even like looks like. I've usually, for students, I would try to simplify it to some kind of like, man, going deep is some kind of increased trust in Christ, evidenced by increased love for others, or it's, increased love for God, or increased knowledge. It's that with concept with him. But that doesn't mean like we move to, a cave in the middle of nowhere or memorize the Greek necessarily. It means that like, as I do that, I'm getting better at loving, the person next to me as well. So there's that, even the picture of, the end game. That goes back to the whole trail marker series, but we can finish it with the last question.
Well,
here.
I do think, if you're watching or listening, and you're like, hey, what is this more? Like, what is more? I would
a few
really
clicks away.
Yeah, I would encourage to go get the book, Mansions of the Heart. You can go on Amazon; they have the book. It's a great book that I would recommend, and I would say. And then be cautious with, because there are, as you go into kind of like, they talk about mansions like 6 and 7 or mansions 5, 6, and 7.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that are in there that are like, what? I have questions about that. And you should ask questions about that.
Yeah.
Because some of those things are quite hard to understand.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger point of the book and why I recommend it is because there is something more. And if you desire something more and you want more depth here at Northpoint, then that's a great place to start.
So, concluding question then.
Sure.
If you're listening and somebody is engaged in Northpoint or trying to become engaged in Northpoint, what can we do as a church to keep all the rungs on the ladder? How would you summarize that succinctly?
So I think like 3 things hit my mind. Read Colossians 3, 1 through 4. Keep our hearts and minds on things above, not on earthly things.
Yeah.
I think if we can keep our hearts and minds collectively as a church on Jesus, then we all sit around the table and we're pulling from the same source. So it's not from your experiences or your feelings or your desires or, from what my pop did or my mama did or my grandfather did. And I'm not saying those things are invalid. I'm just saying ultimately, if we do not pull from the same source, Jesus, then we're going to confuse a lot of people. And so keeping our hearts and minds on things above, I think, would be one of the greatest things we could do. So anything that, for you personally, that allows you to see Jesus more clearly, that allows you to get a greater understanding of who he is, will help us keep all the rungs on the ladder and help alignment here at Northpoint. I think, secondly, I would just say follow the application of Sunday. And so go on npaustin.com/what's next and give us feedback. Like, it's not our weakness that's going to hurt us. It's our blind spots. I have lots of blind spots. And unfortunately, as a church, I'm sure we do as well. And I would really be curious to know what those are. And so it would be very helpful, probably not emotionally satisfying to me, but very helpful If you're listening or watching, if you would please give us feedback. What are we doing as a church that's not making Jesus relevant? What are we doing as a church that perhaps has taken some of the rungs out of the ladder for your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, for you personally? And you're like, listen, here's some rungs that are missing. That is very, very helpful and encourages us to keep all the rungs on the ladder as a church, because now we're aware. And now we can begin to move and do things about it. And last of all, I'd say just take personal action. Like, personally do something about it. Like I alluded to at the beginning. Like, hey, go back to the source. And once you understand who the source is, then let's get busy. This is one of the greatest adventures. We just talked about this in our staff meeting. If we're willing to truly do what Jesus invites us in Luke 9:23 and 24, I'd highly recommend that you read that passage, think about it, ask God what he wants you to hear in that passage. But what Jesus is saying is, guys, there's a cost to do this. This is going to be perhaps the hardest thing you ever do in your entire life. But if you're willing to take up kind of the baton, if you will, if you're willing to follow me, if you're willing to give up, which really does feel like giving up everything from me, you actually will find everything you've desired and wanted and all the things you were pursuing as a result of. You're actually going to find that in me and more. Because I am here, the author of life. I've come to invite you into something so adventurous, so meaningful, so purposeful, and yes, it's going to be hard. That's why he says daily take up your cross. Daily you have to remind yourself in Luke 9:23 and 24. But if you're willing to do that, and then go to npaustin.com/what's next and join a team and look at a place that you can serve. In other words, God's gifted you with a gift, and you have passions around something. We as a church have a lot of opportunity, and we want to align your passions, and we want to align the gifts God's given you and your competencies with opportunities here at Northpoint. And if we can all do this together, it's going to be hard. It perhaps will be one of the hardest things you've ever done, but it will be the most rewarding thing we do and one of the most meaningful things we do, which I said on Sunday. I absolutely believe it will lead to a place we will get to the end of our lives if we can remain faithful and keep our eyes and hearts focused on Jesus. And we will rock on the porch, and we'll look at one another, and we will not have to say very few words, because we had one of the greatest experiences we've ever had in our life. We've experienced adventure. We've experienced life and life to the full, meaningfulness in a way we've never experienced it in our life before, pursuing this thing called the church, the ecclesia, the Greek word that means a movement of people around one single truth, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's what I would say. Get involved, get after it, and let's see what God does.
If you guys don't already have one, then we need to buy you a rocking chair for you to have at the end, because as often as I've heard you paint that picture, you need to be rocking. You can't sit in a stationary chair.
Well, I picture at Cracker Barrel, they have those in the front. I love Cracker Barrel, the French toast at Cracker Barrel. Yeah. Woo, delicious. But they have the rocking chairs, and I when I walk up there, that's what I pictured, that rocking chair.
Where it comes from. Okay, yeah, well, you need to ask if you can just get one sometime. But
yeah, one day.
No, I'd second that. I encourage people to do it, because I've watched you have conversations with our staff this week off of feedback that people have given. Like, you really do read it, listen to it, take it seriously, and it's so helpful to us. So thanks for leading us through the series. It's concluding this weekend, so if you haven't seen part 1 and 2, then for sure catch up. It's one of those series that it's not just a Northpoint series. Our vision is inspired by what we believe we're called to be as Christians, and so that's why I've loved the series. It gets some really meaning and purpose of life type stuff in the series, honestly, what we're called to. So it's been awesome, and I'm excited for part 3 this weekend.
Awesome. Thank you, man.